Hello, and welcome to our online webinar series hosted by National Sorghum Producers. My name is Jennifer Warren. I'm Vice President of Communications at NSP, and I will serve as your moderator today. Today, we're covering Session 1, Building Resilient Systems and the Economic Impact of Double Crop Sorghum. The basis for this webinar series started with recent enhancements to crop insurance policies by USDA RMA. So National Sorghum Producers is taking the opportunity to educate growers about new options available to them. This is our first webinar in a series of 3 designed to discuss critical updates and opportunities in sorghum crop insurance, as well as the opportunities surround them, which is much of what we'll be talking about today. Our speakers today are Matt Durler, Managing Director for Climate Smart Sorghum at National Sorghum Producers, and John Duff, Principal of Serō Ag Strategies. Matt serves as Managing Director for National Sorghum Producers' Climate Smart Commodities Grant. He hails from a sorghum, wheat, and beef farm near Dodge City, Kansas, and brings a wealth of experience and expertise to his role. With a bachelor's degree in business administration, finance, economics, and management, as well as an MBA from Washburn University, Matt has a deep understanding of both the ag and financial aspects of the industry. His previous roles in risk management and marketing at prominent ag organizations have honed his skills in driving sustainable growth and maximizing potential. John Duff is founder of Serō Ag Strategies, a boutique consulting agency in ag and sustainability strategy. Previously, he served as Executive Vice President for National Sorghum Producers, where he provided leadership in key moments, including Chinese investigating the U.S. sorghum industry, NSP's successful effort to secure a $65 million USDA Partnerships for Climate Smart Commodities Grant Award. He's a 2-time graduate of Texas Tech University and has several distinguished alumni awards, including an honorary Lone Star degree recipient. Before we begin, I want to call your attention to the Q&A box as we go along during the presentation. If you have a question, feel free to drop a question into that Q&A box. It's located here in the bottom right corner of your screen with the triangle, circle, and square. Now I will kick it over to John Duff to begin the webinar.
Today we're going to lay the groundwork and talk about building resilient systems and the economic impact of double crop sorghum, both from an agronomic and environmental perspective, but also from a sustainability and a carbon perspective. We're also going to talk about those resilient farming systems and what they do agronomically and for the environment and the ecology on the farm. And we're going to talk about policy opportunities. And then we're going to wrap up talking about water and sustainability in farming.
Yeah, thanks, John. I think when we think about water and sustainability, double crop sorghum becomes a really interesting kind of emerging concept. Something we've had a lot of in central Kansas and some parts of South Dakota for a long time now. But as we look at indirect land use, which we'll get into a little bit further, and then as we think about the durability of some of these cropping systems and how we can conserve water while still supporting animal agriculture, it's really becoming an important tool in the farmer's toolbox. And we'll dive into some of those benefits a little more later. I think, near and dear to all of us here is, why is sorghum so special? And like probably a good deal of the people on the call, it's really tough. It grows in places on land that not everything will. Sorghum and wheat are some of the hardiest crops we have, and they work well together, but it's known for being hardy, conservative on water, and really a durable crop year in and year out. And that provides kind of 2 different opportunities. One, the opportunity to go with maybe a shorter season variety in a double crop situation, predominantly with wheat or another winter crop, where we can get more bushels off of the same acres in the same year. The other one being the ghost crop bushels, and that might look like Texas Panhandle in a year where cotton fails and we've got some really vulnerable exposed ground. and the ability to bring a crop in that can still conserve the landscape and be productive at the same time. We talk about ghost crop. And in both scenarios, this would be considered an intermediate crop or a cover crop as we look at some of the fuels markets. And these are a bonus because they're truly additional bushels or additional productivity to the ground. They don't have any indirect land use charge. And it becomes an important part of telling the story, both of production agriculture in our area and the opportunities that come from renewable fuels, particularly ethanol. This sustainable intensification, which lowers that carbon footprint, you think about it as greening the landscape. How do we get more growing days out of that same field? And sorghum is really unique in its ability to fit into these systems in that way. And when we think about that, the ability to build a resilient system, in a lot of cases, we're doing the things we do now because we just know it works over time. But with new economic incentives and more data coming into play, we can really look at our farming systems differently. And I think resilience is just that, the ability to provide some diversity and some stability. And as the old adage goes, if it don't make dollars, it won't make sense. It's never been truer than it is now. And that comes in a couple of different ways. One, we can reduce risk by having a more diverse cropping system that is a little more resilient. We think about the timing of heat and rain, but also bringing in additional revenue sources as we think about some of the benefits that come from these carbon markets. And the emerging markets around water kind of add into that. And when we think about systems, it's really important that we think not only the crop, but also how that interacts with value-added agriculture, particularly animal agriculture. And within the sorghum belt, that's really heavily reliant on beef and dairy. So when we think about those resilient systems, how do we tell our story and really reduce risk while improving the revenue opportunities we might have? And every time I'm in front of a group of producers, I like to bring this up. Whether we like it or not, we're all in the data business now. I mean, you think about this being a logarithmic scale of data that when we get to the right side of this graph, it's important to realize we'll generate more data in the next 12 months generated in all of recorded history prior to 2020. You think about that. Think about the impact of AI. Think about the tools that are at our disposal as we get better at incorporating some of these things. It's really kind of mind-boggling to think about. But with that data becomes a whole other way of looking at production agriculture that maybe we didn't have a generation ago. And when we think about just what we're doing within the Climate Smart grant, we've partnered with Farmers Edge for that reason, to allow farmers to have a different relationship with that information. And I suspect there's people on this call that would cover the whole spectrum in terms of how they're handling their record keeping in a very manual or shoebox kind of way to really using the telematics and technology that may be on their sprayer, tractor, or combine today. But we wanted to have a platform that allowed a starting spot to start to record more of this data in a structured way, make better decisions, and to think about how we move forward. And I think this is important for a couple of different reasons. One, the better information we have on each piece of ground, the better decisions we can make about how to manage that. Or maybe even where we need to look at an NRCS program for putting that into conservation, be it CRP or a butterfly habitat, some of that. But then also we can get the right amount of nutrients applied as we go across the field. And we're able to use this information to really tell our story to people maybe that don't come from production agriculture. And I think a carbon intensity score is just that. It's just a universal language to tell our story and the efficiency of the systems we operate in. But there's more here than ever before as decision tools. If we can get it organized in a logical way, it's a lot easier to actually make a productive part of our operations.
Yeah, and the data piece is really a common thread that kind of is woven throughout all of these discussions. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And there's nowhere where that's more true than in the sustainability space. The data is a key driver and unlocks the opportunities for the farmers in all of these things. It's going to be key in the carbon models. It's going to be key in indirect land use change discussions, which we'll get further into the weeds on here in a second. And it's also going to be important to those regulators and those modeling government agencies that are policy drivers. And it's going to be important to General Mills and other consumer packaged goods companies that are creating the inset programs that we'll talk about here in a little while. But before we move on, though, a little bit about what the carbon intensity score is really comprised of. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding of what actually drives carbon intensity scores and what they actually are. You hear a lot of talk about carbon intensity and the carbon footprint and the score and soil carbon sequestration and things along those lines. But there's really a lot of unknown, I think, kind of generally in the agricultural public about what actually drives carbon scores and what actually they are. And it's kind of interesting because they're really simple when you kind of break it down. It's less about physics or chemistry or science and more just about accounting. If you can build a crop budget, you can probably build a carbon intensity score. What actually drives it is here in front of you right now, and it is mostly nitrogen fertilizer, interestingly, more so than soil carbon sequestration. About 27% of the emissions of the carbon footprint of farming is based on the production of nitrogen. It's really input intensive, it's energy intensive, and thus the carbon intensity of that nitrogen fertilizer is pretty high. But the other thing that happens with nitrogen fertilizer is it leaches, it volatilizes, and it runs off. And so 50% of that score is driven by those losses of nitrogen after it has been applied. So a little bit of backing out a little bit to give you a little more perspective on how exactly that goes in and drives the carbon intensity of the final product like a fuel. Ethanol overall is 65 grams. And to give you a little bit of a comparison and scale of how ethanol would stack up against gasoline, for example, an average gallon of gasoline is about 100 grams. And so ethanol being 65 grams has a significantly lower carbon footprint. Of that, about 30 grams is driven by the farming emissions. And so the pie chart that you just saw represents the breakdown of those 30 grams that actually make up the carbon intensity of farming itself. More talk about why sorghum is so special is it has a number of inherent advantages. One of those inherent advantages, it's grown in a dry climate. So everything to the left of this blue line, evaporation is actually outstripping precipitation. And so there's a net negative moisture situation on a long-term basis. And it just so happens that that's where most of the sorghum is grown. And so given that big 50% of emissions number in the carbon footprint of farming should probably be half of where it is. So if the models are just accurately representing the fact that sorghum is grown in a dry climate, there's an inherent opportunity for the crop in carbon models. There's also, of course, an opportunity in indirect land use change. So Matt alluded to it earlier, but double crop bushels are actually a bonus to the system. Indirect land use change is a controversial theory that using crops to produce biofuels in the U.S. Has a knock-on effect that causes deforestation abroad, mostly in Brazil. But for a double crop bushel, that bushel is a bonus to the system. It's a bushel that the system isn't expecting, and thus that knock-on effect actually doesn't happen with double crop sorghum or sorghum grown behind failed cotton, as an example. It's a pretty big impact. The penalty for indirect land use change, or ILUC, is 10 to 20 grams, depending on the model. And on a 65 gram gallon of ethanol, 10 to 20 grams is a significant amount. So it just goes to show you the scale of the opportunity. If double crop sorghum, if sorghum grown behind failed cotton is just accurately reflected in the carbon models for these biofuel markets.
And I think when we think about it, then the question becomes, So it's great. So how do we make it make money, right? And that really becomes the crux of where we want to go with some of this discussion. Historically, we've always thought about the Farm Bill as the key policy cornerstone for agriculture. And while that's still largely the case, it's become far more complex when we think about how things like NRCS, EQIP, and CSP, which used to be heavily structured around structural practices, building terraces, wells, those kind of things, are now actually involved in environmental practices and climate smart practices, creating opportunities that we can put real information out there on how these have a positive impact on production agriculture. And when we think about how the regulatory markets might be looking at this, policy around how we do that and how we educate the decision makers becomes a really important part of a multifaceted approach to policy that probably looks different today than it ever has before in history. And when we think about that, even from the ethanol space I come from, historically, EPA was kind of the key cornerstone of everything ethanol. And then the California Air Resources Board being the vehicle that created avenues for lower carbon ethanol to be monetized. When we think about the Inflation Reduction Act and how these things come together today, we also have not only the USDA and the Department of Energy, but also the IRS engaged now. And then when we think about Europe, we also have the Renewable Energy Directive there as a key piece of this. And it's important to think about how these things come together and how we interact with and educate these policy decision makers. The Department of Energy and our Argonne Labs is the key driving structure behind the carbon models that John just talked about. And then the IRS, actually, the tax credits there, probably the biggest opportunity for climate smart farm practices to make an impact on the bottom line. And that's through what they call the low carbon fuels production credit. What this is a tax credit that should start in 2025. So the crop is being grown right now, be it corn or sorghum, or actually, if we're going to renewable diesel, we could consider the oil seeds as well. But for each point below 50 grams for the ethanol plant, there's an additional 2-cent tax credit all the way down to zero. So an ethanol plant, they could get their carbon intensity to zero, they would have the opportunity for $1 a gallon tax credit. And when we think about the size and scale of these ethanol plants, there's a lot of dollars that can come into rural America because of this. But to John's point, these farm practices in themselves realistically make an impact of 7 to maybe even 15 points. But if we just look at 10 points and said, well, at 10 grams and we get 3 grams or 3 gallons for every bushel, that's the opportunity to create 60 cents an opportunity to be shared between the farmer and the ethanol plants in that tax credit. Well, there'll be some slide in that, but as we get down here around break-even prices for farmers, being able to add, maybe another $20 or $30 an acre in your sorghum and a multiple of that into the corn, it becomes a really big thing to look at. At the same time, these are things that make productive sense to do today. We think about no-till, and we think about crop rotations, and we think about how we manage nitrogen. These are all things that should pay for themselves, and now we have an economic incentive out in front of us to do so. And the important thing about the scale of ethanol for these plants that can get under 50 grams is it's big enough to absorb a large amount of this feedstock, be it the sorghum and corn in the area. And unique to the sorghum belt is the ethanol plants, because they are close to cattle, aren't having to dry their distillers grains and are in the right kind of formation to sequester CO2. So each of them have the ability to get under this 50 grams. And that's not necessarily the case in a good part of the corn belt. So it's an opportunity for folks in this area to use those feedstocks to tell their story, but also generate some real revenue on the farm. And the same thing becomes of that ILEC discussion as we continue to push that forward, both domestically within the tax credit, but also within the regulated fuels markets here in the U.S. on the West Coast, to go up into Canada and in Europe, opportunities to hopefully leverage that to go further, not only take advantage of the tax credits, but also have an opportunity to monetize that carbon, be it in the regulated market or potentially even an inset market, as John alluded to earlier.
one market we're looking at, and it's spent a tremendous amount of time on lately, and will a significant amount over the next couple of years, is Europe. The Renewable Energy Directive, or RED II, is Europe's version of the U.S. Renewable Fuel Standard, basically. And the sustainability framework and standard that drives that is ISCC. It's a pass-fail model, and so the actual score matters less. But if a farmer collects data, gives that to the ethanol plant, and then the ethanol plant goes through a verification process, that plant can sell into Europe under RED II and the ISCC for a small premium. And one thing that's really important to Europe is green vegetation days, right? Is making sure that the amount of days that there's green growing vegetation covering the landscape is as high as possible. That's one thing that's really important to Europe. And so they look a lot at crops that grow behind other crops, at crops that would grow maybe on marginal land where other things wouldn't be growing, crops that represent sustainable intensification, double crops, same principle as having a cover crop out there with a living root that lengthens the amount of time that there's a root out there working on soil health, soil microbiology. That's one thing that Europe really looks at. And so they tend to incentivize those crops that do that. And so paying a significant amount of attention and doing a lot of work with those groups in Europe and ethanol plants that are selling into Europe because of the opportunity to tell that sorghum story and attain a premium, because sorghum builds resiliency in those green vegetation days across the landscape. Other markets that we're paying attention to are low carbon fuel standard in California, which is administered by the California Air Resources Board. The scoring framework that I went through earlier is actually mirrors very closely the one used by the California Air Resources Board. And they're one that has a really, really stiff penalty for indirect land use change of about 20 grams. And so to the extent that those models more accurately reflect the fact that sorghum can be grown as a double crop, or in those situations where there wouldn't otherwise be anything growing on the land, we have a significant opportunity financially to add a large value to sorghum that is sold into California. And there are a number of other policy drivers as well. RMA, of course, which we'll get into in later webinars, and the crop insurance opportunities for insuring double crop sorghum and these other crops. The Farm Bill is obviously a huge driver. It kind of underpins a lot of these things. It's what allocates a lot of funding for NRCS, which of course is the group that pays farmers for a lot of these practices. Increasingly, the IRS is involved, not just through the biofuel production tax credit, but also with bonus depreciation, the R&D tax credit that could potentially defray the costs that farmers would incur of implementing these practices. And then there are other fuel markets. The California LCFS, Oregon has a similar standard, Washington, there's Europe, of course, there's Canada, Colombia, Japan, Mexico, China, even a number of countries on the African continent that have some kind of fuel standard. So a lot of policy drivers among that group of regulatory agencies concerned about fuel. And then there's the modeling agencies and the research agencies that are doing work to empower a lot of these frameworks and empower farmers and give the farmers the knowledge that they need to do these things and do them well.
And I think an important part of all this is the understanding that in order to educate each of these policy decision makers, whether it be domestically or in Europe, as John hit on, we need good quality information to demonstrate how the crop fits and how these market access things can provide real opportunities to improve the sustainability of the fuel cycles, but also have a better scope of how all production agriculture looks. So the importance of information not only matters on your farm, but also as an industry as we try to educate the key stakeholders, both domestically and abroad. And, you know, we've spent most of the time so far talking about carbon, but there's no doubt that water sustainability is probably the easiest thing to explain and understand the longevity of the aquifer that we sit on here in sorghum country. We've seen the challenges we go further south in the panhandle where water resources have been completely depleted already, and we realize the pace at which we're depleting them in southwest Kansas it's just not sustainable. So how do we look at systems that can sustain the value-added production we have out here, particularly in beef and dairy, at the same time providing the income that we need on the farm, long-term, durable manner? And sorghum has such a compelling story to tell here, but it's really important that we have the data that accompanies this, and that we work on not only saving money and water at the farm gate, but make sure that we can utilize these crops through the whole supply chain in a way that sustains the animal agriculture in this area. So as we look forward, while a lot of the outside investment has come in the carbon front, I think you're really starting to see that come in water as well, and thinking in a very integrated sense about how we do more with less. How might we have a reuse situation with water in our local ethanol plant or local municipality? And these are really important discussions to think of from a very macro perspective as we go forward. I think something John hit on here that's really important to touch on too is the CPG interest. We're really pleased to have General Mills working with us, looking at the full systems approach here in central Kansas of a wheat sorghum fallow rotation, and then looking at the impact that grazing beef have on that system, literally walking off a third crop in the form of beef if we're grazing stocks, or sustaining cow-calf pairs on the stocks rather, and then raising yearlings on the wheat. But their interest not only in reducing the carbon footprint of everything they source, but also helping to support the long-term viability of their supply sheds, and doing that to things that just add efficiency and add durability. And these guys have been tremendous partners, but they speak to how they look at the overall systems and risk that their businesses have, the same way that you have risk in your business in terms of productivity. If we have crop failures year in and year out, they have a supply shed that's underserved and the inability to produce the products they produce today. And so the interesting thing in this wheat sorghum rotation is they don't today use a lot of sorghum in their ration or in their feed products, but they understand the importance of sorghum in that wheat rotation, and its importance of understanding how these things operate together to produce a long-term viable production system. And that system story is such an important part of telling the efficiency, talking about how earlier when John showed that evapotranspiration line, when we have a drought in this part of the country, we tend to store that nitrogen for the next crop and still be able to utilize that later on. So we don't have these large fluxes in nitrogen efficiency. Really, it's just an opportunity to utilize that as we go. And I think we're seeing an increase in this area. Large companies that want to understand more about the suppliers in their region and what really makes them work, and what it takes to try new things that we think have long-term durable benefits in that regard. As I indicated a little bit before, the water story is one that's just not going away, and much has been made of Lake Mead when we look west, but it's a pretty compelling picture. And how do we address these things has to be a systems sort of approach as we see shifting weather patterns, but also the opportunity to conserve more, as this has an impact on every part of our lives, from the crops, the food systems, but also the opportunity to live in areas west of here. And I think this is something we need to be mindful of as we go forward. And for those of you guys with irrigated production systems, think about what information you're collecting today and how you're really looking at optimizing production and profitability per acre inch of water, acre foot of water, in lieu of just maximizing production, because that efficiency metric, I think, becomes really a key part of what we do going forward. And then, how do we use that data, that carbon intensity, to tell the story of the production system, to explain efficiency, to show how we produce twice as much beef with half as many cattle as they do in Argentina? How do we tell those sort of stories and inform the markets that we really are doing the things we need to do around efficiency?
Yeah, and I think the key here is the story and the data are both sort of equally important, and they kind of enable each other, right? Like you can't you can't tell a story and drive a narrative without actually having something to back it up. But it also creates the opportunity for like a two-way dialogue. I think ag has probably struggled in the past with that dialogue being just one direction. We often thought that if we just told the story better, then our consumer would understand and we could go forward in a more positive way for ag. But I think that sort of discounts the opportunity for there to be a feedback loop and for us to understand what our customers and consumers actually want and need. The data that we're delivering to them creates that opportunity for there to be that feedback loop and for the dialogue to go back and forth where we're telling our story, but we're also understanding what they want and how we can get better based on what they want in a way that drives economic opportunity on the farm for us in agriculture.
Yeah, I think that's well put, John. We understand the needs of these companies or even governments. We can understand what role agriculture can play in filling those needs. We have an important role to play in a compelling story to tell.
Well, thank you, John and Matt, for that insight. And at this time, we will take questions. Again, you can click on the triangle, square, circle in the bottom right of your screen and feel free to ask questions there. And we'll take those at this time. And if we don't have any questions, I'll take this opportunity to remind everyone about our upcoming webinars in this 3-part series. So session 2, Navigating Double Crop Sorghum Production and Insurance, will take place January 21st at a time to be announced. This discussion will be led by Chris Cogburn, Manager of Sustainable Crop Insurance Services, and Dr. Brent Bean, Agronomy Director for the Sorghum Checkoff. That's an overview of policy adjustments for double cropping and sorghum, as well as eliminating barriers for ensuring double crop irrigated sorghum. Practical advice on how farmers can work with their crop insurance agents to apply for written agreements, and then those agronomic considerations for optimal double crop sorghum production. The third part of our webinar series will focus on sorghum silage insurance. Again, that discussion being led by Chris Cogburn, Manager of Sustainable Crop Insurance Services. He'll go over detailed simplifications made to the sorghum silage insurance policy, especially the removal of the 2-year history requirement for insuring irrigated sorghum silage, as well as the use of annual forage for non-irrigated sorghum silage and some nuances in different counties and states related to that. It looks like we do have a question from Chris Johnson. How is the speed of regulatory affecting carbon intensity?
I think we have to look at all of these things being dual focused. No doubt that, especially when we look at that agency or a working group that is working on 45Z, it's long and complex because you have a lot of competing interests there. And you could definitely accelerate some of this through quicker policy decisions. But I think it's important to acknowledge the role the private industry has in these inset programs and incentivizing these things as well. And I think you're seeing great movements there and maybe even acceleration in the front of the private markets that pairs up with some of the regulatory. The holy grail is getting the same things to count both ways, making sure we're collecting the right data to suffice for both markets. John, do you have other thoughts in that regard?
Yeah, and I'm smiling because I've spent a number of years of my career going through and following and going from kind of place to place, connecting dots in that sort of regulatory framework that drives a lot of these things. So I mentioned a little bit about the modeling agencies and the research agencies that are driving those models. And one of them is DOE. The GREET model that we talked about is came out of the Argonne National Lab in Chicago, and in 2014, the data source that underlaid the GREET model changed, and there was really no alternative. There was no data to switch to, and so sorghum was kind of penalized in that because it was a data source that wasn't quite as representative of reality on the ground as the previous one had been. And so we've spent 10 years in collecting data and generating data and doing research to better understand sorghum's carbon footprint and the inputs that go into sorghum, so that we can inform those models in a positive way, because the models are key to unlocking the value in most of these frameworks. And so it definitely, not just regulatory, but the modeling agencies and the research agencies also have a role to play there, that does kind of create tails. It creates a front end tail and a need to have lead time in anything you're doing in any of these spaces, because they have to be backed up by well-reasoned data, well-reasoned science, collected and verified in a transparent way. And it does create challenges. And having to really start early on one of these programs, no doubt. But the opportunity there to really learn about your carbon footprint in those data collection endeavors and learn where you can be better, not just from a sustainability perspective, but a general ag productivity perspective, is pretty significant as well, even though sometimes the complexity and the time it takes to get one of these across the finish line can be frustrating.
So another question is, how does NSP's Climate Smart program and Farm Command system relate to the information presented today?
Sure. So a good deal of the information that we need for these carbon markets is also the things that the USDA is requiring for climate smart participants. And our goal within national sorghum producers is to use the Farm Command platform as kind of the data repository, where farmers can use it as a management tool if they choose to. If not, we can use it as a data collection spot. But we can use those things to then work towards 45Z or voluntary markets as well. So since Climate Smart, the opportunities there are payment for practice, very similar to what CSP would be. We have the opportunity to double dip, so to speak, in how we sell those commodities. And that's something we're working on pretty hard internally, is creating those opportunities for win-wins, both with the ethanol companies, which is kind of how that grant was designed, but also with the food and beverage companies as well. Any place that needs that resilient story and has the opportunity to monetize that. So farmers can really do both, but the Farmers Edge platform is kind of the backbone of our data collection, and hopefully a tool that producers can use beyond the life of the grant.
And I think another question is, did you say it is a negative effect to your carbon score for having double crop sorghum?
I'll take that one. No, just the opposite. It is a potentially a significantly positive opportunity for sorghum farmers that are growing sorghum double crop. And there's a couple of different ways in which that could be positive. One is the nitrogen footprint. So we talked about nitrogen driving about 77% of the carbon footprint of farming. If you grow double crop, for example, and don't put nitrogen on it because you're relying on nitrogen carryover, then that's a significant opportunity in the nitrogen footprint. But there's also an opportunity in indirect land use change. Remember, 10 to 20 grams of a 65 gram average ethanol score is driven by indirect land use change penalties. Double crop sorghum shouldn't have those indirect land use change penalties because those bushels are in effect a bonus to the system. And so that 10 to 20 grams, if the model is reflective of that reality on the ground, should be subtracted from the score of sorghum grown in a double crop situation, reducing maybe 16 to 25%, depending on the model, the carbon footprint of that ethanol gallon made from that bushel grown on a double crop sorghum acre.
Thanks, John. And the last question I see here now is, has there been a standard set for carbon sampling protocols? Seems like there are a lot of companies that are doing their own sampling standards and none of them are consistent. Maybe this was discussed already since I was late in jumping on the webinar.
So I'll start here and let John run with it as well. I think it's important that we look at the differences between insets and offsets, and to say that in the voluntary space, there is no standardization. While there's some protocols people may follow, but a carbon offset is something that somebody may purchase that has a unrelated carbon emission that they're wanting to lay off. Think of maybe Microsoft having a challenge in Washington State and wanting to buy credits to offset that. In those cases, a lot of times soil organic carbon has been viewed as a very positive opportunity, but carbon build in the soil takes a long time, 5-10 years, and those are long-term programs where they're trying to measure change in the soil organic carbon based upon farm practices. And those are somewhat susceptible to being reversed if we go in and till those fields afterwards. So that offset market, and it can be kind of nuanced, it's not all around soil organic carbon, but has a lot of different tentacles to it. When we think about insets, that's more like something we're going to consume in this crop here. And those would typically be shorter in their lifespan or the duration we're talking about in the program. So in an inset, it is a little more straightforward, although not completely defined. If we use the GREET model, which John did a really good job of walking through earlier, a lot of that is related to nitrogen efficiency and chemical efficiency and productivity of the land. Those things are a fair bit more consistent in the standardization. But in everything in this space, it's a matter of being able to back up what you're doing with science. That goes back to the data to prove how much fertilizer do we have to put down for this yield, what were those farm practices, and those sort of things as the standardization continues to evolve.
And remember, from a biofuels perspective, which biofuels markets, even regulated biofuels markets like the low carbon fuel standard in California, is effectively an inset program. That is paying the ethanol plant to drive emissions reductions in its own supply chain, right? So to drive emissions reductions on the farm. So inset programs like that, and specifically biofuels programs, carbon emissions on the farm only make up 5 to 10% of those emissions. And so at least with regard to biofuels opportunities and opportunities around double crop, sorghum as a ghost crop or other intermediate crop situations that we talked about today, the carbon is mathematically a much smaller portion of the footprint anyway, and nitrogen is a lot bigger. Not to say in the offset programs that Matt talked a little bit about that they're not important. They definitely are, but a lot of what we focused on more significantly, and again, what we talked about here today in biofuel markets, carbon is a much smaller piece of the footprint overall.
I think a key part of that too, in the California Resources Board and several of these pieces we're talking about really do a good job of highlighting how we're driving carbon down through efficiency, the things that'll pay for themselves as we go. The ethanol plant will lower carbon intensity because they're using less natural gas for production, or they have a higher yield per bushel that they bring in. They're invested in things that save electricity. The same thing's true when we look at the farm gate and people really pushing the envelope on nitrogen efficiency or nutrient efficiency as a whole. I know there's a handful of crop advisors on. When we think about the antagonistic relationship we have through some of the nutrients we need for crops and people really understanding how to manage the field at a much smaller level, those are things that have great productivity benefits that also, as a cherry on top, have a carbon benefit that we hope to monetize.
The last question is, will these slides be presented today? And yes, that is one of the wrap-up items. Plan to send out this recorded webinar to those who have registered after this. So yes, that will be provided. If there are no more questions, I think we are ready to conclude. Thank you so much for being a part of this webinar. If you would like to give us feedback, you can look to the chat box. There is a link there, or scan the QR code on your screen. and that will take you to a survey letting us know how the webinar went. There is contact information for Matt and John there if you will need to do any follow-up with them afterward. Thank you for being a part of our webinar today.